Hello, and welcome to the show. What am I doing? I've actually gagged myself. Now, this is what we're going to talk about. This is probably the most Alan Partridge thing I've done, and that is quite the base level for me to start from. You'll often see images of people who have on front pages, ironically, of the Sunday Times magazine or the Daily Mail with like sellotape over their mouths or having gagged themselves in the way I just did. And I think it's quite a good illustration of this whole discussion we're having today about free speech, because they've voluntarily done it performatively and they can take it off whenever they want. And they're doing it on the front pages of mass circulation media outlets where they claim to be silenced. Being silenced these days or telling everyone you've been silenced, is the best possible avenue to start the I've Been Silenced tour. Maybe you could start the tour, I don't know, with a front page on the Daily Mail, I've been silenced, followed by a follow-up op-ed in the Daily Telegraph about your horrendous silencing, followed by the Today programme, Newsnight, Question Time, a book, obviously the book deal with the title I've Been Silenced. And then you can do your national I've Been Silenced tour all over the country where you tell thousands of people about your silencing. That is a debate we have constant. I mean, we can parody it, but it is something that happens. Now, that's what we're talking about today. For those who are joining us on watching it live, welcome. For those listening to this on the podcast, also welcome. Please do give us 5 stars, helps get the word out. But thank you, and subscribe to the podcast as well if you haven't. What we're doing today is we're having a show dedicated to one of the big supposed debates of our time, which is about the declaration of war by the so-called woke left on free speech, which has turned universities into places where free expression and free debate has been shut down by an intolerant woke mob, necessitating government intervention with a free speech czar in order to enforce free speech on campuses across the country. Now, what we're going to do today is show the reality of this entirely false debate and about how the real threat to freedom of expression and free speech isn't actually coming from the left at all, but from the right, and yes, the government of the day that is in charge. It was illustrated quite well today by a tweet by Alistair Heath, who is the editor, I believe he's still the editor of the Sunday Telegraph. And in that he said, this is Alistair Heath, who is the editor of the Sunday Telegraph. So he is a newspaper editor for a mass circulation broadsheet newspaper. And he said the war on woke won't be won until it's no longer toxic to admit you're a conservative. Now, dear, to the audience watching, I might remind you, in case you haven't noticed, that we have a conservative government with an 80-seat majority and a press which overwhelmingly editorially supports the conservative government, and during general elections actively campaigns for the Conservative Party in the most partisan and overt way possible. And yet conservatives still are presenting themselves, well, even more so than ever, as oppressed victims who are unable to say what they really think. And this is the debate on freedom of expression or free speech that we're having in this country, when people who say often very bigoted things about minorities who don't have a voice, in terms of silencing trans politicians, you can't, because there are no trans members of parliament, or trans journalists, there are very, very few, and most of those that do exist on freelance insecure contracts. And yet those who use their platforms to say bigoted things about minorities, in repeating what much of the mainstream media says about those minorities, repeating bigotries and prejudices that are very widespread in society, which millions of people tragically happen to subscribe to, they claim that those opinions are the ones that are besieged, that people are intolerant of and are being silenced. And that has escalated, as I say, this week with the appointment of a so-called free speech czar, which is exceptionally ominous for reasons we're going to discuss in this program. Now, before we kick off and bring in the esteemed guest, because that's quite enough of me, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're not watching this on YouTube, please do come in, click on the YouTube link. It helps support the show, get the message out. I know most of you aren't watching this on YouTube right now, but it is very helpful if you click on the YouTube link and then you can watch the show live. When you're through to YouTube, press subscribe and like first, like it. Do that now, immediately. That helps get the word out. And press subscribe and the notification bell, and that will mean you get notifications when we do these. For those supporting us on Patreon as we expand, thank you very much. If you go to patreon.com/Owen Jones84, that way you can help us decide who we speak to, what issues we talk about like this today, which people wanted us to talk about, who we interview, what polemics we do, what documentaries we do. So thank you for that. And also on this show, if you want to support the show and put questions to our panel of guests, use Super Chat. You press the $ below and you can put forward questions, which I will put to the guests, and I will thank you all by name at the end. Right. That's enough of that. Let us bring in the first two guests who we're very, very lucky to have. Bring in Gavan Titley, who is author of the book, Is Free Speech Racist? We'll talk about that. And Sam Fowles, who is a barrister and also has recently written a very good article on the hysteria whipped up by the right on free speech. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us.
Cheers.
Thanks for having us.
To kick off, right, let's just start from basics, because I think the way free speech is talked about is there's this attempt to muddy the water about what free speech is in the first place. And often, the right will equate the right to a platform with free speech, for example. So I just want to ask you both, let's do a pithy opening. How do you define what free speech and the right to free speech is? Who wants to start with that?
Sam does.
All right, Sam. Oh, sorry. That's cowardly, by the way, Gavan, but fine. Here you go.
I feel like I've been over-platformed by Gavan. Well, free speech is a legal concept. It's a right defined in the European Convention on Human Rights. It's a right defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And all these things say the same thing, which is that the government should not punish you for expressing your opinion, but within reasonable bounds. So there has never been a complete and unadulterated right to free speech. It's always subject to what the reasonable bounds of society are. So, for example, you can't use your free speech to encourage people to murder other people. And if in court, what happens when you do a free speech case is the court says, right, okay, I get that this person has maybe been punished for what they said or not been allowed to say something. But is what they said so far outside the bounds of reasonable speech that there's a legitimate social reason for limiting it?
Very, very pithy. I love it. I love it, pithiness. Gavan, go on. In you go.
Can I be pithy too? I'm not sure. I mean, I'd like to just try to complement what Sam was talking about there in legal terms, and to say a couple of things. I think, we're going to be very critical of the way in which freedom of speech is currently interpreted and used and instrumentalized in political debate. But I think it's also important to acknowledge many of the reasons why people feel, sort of attracted to and emotionally invested in the defense of freedom of speech, no matter what way it's spoken about. In that, we are, none of us are far away from histories of people who have struggled for the right to freedom of speech in the service of opposing some form of oppression, for example. And also, I mean, when we speak, we give some sort of expression to ourselves, to our subjectivity, to who we are. It's very central, how we understand ourselves. So I suppose in the kind of broad, if to complement the legal start that we got from Sam with a more sort of, I suppose, philosophical understanding of freedom of speech, in the broad sort of liberal tradition, which gives us a lot of the language for the debates that we see in the UK and elsewhere, there are two ways of understanding the importance of freedom of speech. One is a kind of a moral good. It is an expression of our autonomy. We shouldn't be coerced and we shouldn't be restricted by others. And then secondly, there's a kind of often called instrumental or consequentialist set of ideas, which is that freedom of speech does good things. It helps us to improve democratic life. It helps us to progress the world of ideas. It helps us make scientific breakthroughs. It helps us reach greater understanding. It helps us in grand terms to approach the truth and so forth. So those are the kinds of ideas which underpin a lot of the value which is placed on freedom of speech. The problem is, of course, and we'll get into this, is that the way in which most people experience speech in their lives just doesn't look anything like that.
Sam, you wrote a recent article for politics.co.uk, I believe, and it was about why this is manufactured and false, this so-called free speech crisis. And it's interesting because there was, you get right-wing think tanks like the Adam Smith Institute, which have really pushed this idea of a free speech crisis. They claim there's no platform and give Peter Tatchell I'll let you actually talk about that because you mentioned it in the article.
Yeah.
But this review, so there's a review of 10,000 speaker events across the country. And of those 10,000 speaker events, 6 were cancelled, 4 lacked the required paperwork, 1 was a fraudster recruiting for a pyramid scheme, and another was Jeremy Corbyn. And in that case, his rally was just moved to a larger venue off campus to accommodate the number of people. So just talk us through this.
Well, there's sort of there's 2 levels of kind of lie, I suppose, involved in this, what I call the pseudo free speech crisis. And on the first level, lots of citation.
Wait, it sounds more iffy. 1 second, let's have a look. What happened there? Oh, try again. Carry on, Sam. See what happens.
Back. So on the first level, it's lots of references to events that didn't happen at all or didn't happen in the way that's been described. So you mentioned Peter Tatchell was supposedly cancelled or no platformed. Actually, what happened was a representative from the NUS who was going to speak on the same platform as him privately emailed the organizer of the event and said, "Look, I'm not comfortable with this. I'm just not going to come. Is that okay?" And this was blown up to be, Peter Tatchell being cancelled. The government's proposals are based on a paper, a series of papers by Policy Exchange, which again cite an incident in Cardiff where Germaine Greer was supposedly cancelled and prevented from speaking, and except she wasn't. The event went ahead. She rocked up. She did her chat, and some people protested, and that was that. So and I could go on and on about this, and just take you through all of these different instances and why they're rubbish. Matthew Goodwin, one of the main sort of media commentators claiming to have been cancelled, when you actually drill down into to what was done to him, it amounts to essentially people quoting his own words back at him, and he didn't like that. This one level is they're mostly made up or distorted, but it's really hard to go through and rebut all of those in real time. And so these ideas sort of spread, and when they are rebutted, then it's never given, of course, the same prominence as the original accusation. But then you get onto a second level, and that is that actually what we're talking about here isn't anything to do with, I've been thinking about this. Is it anything to do with speech? Now, actually, it is to do with speech, but it's not the free speech of the person who has been cancelled. If I've got a platform, you've got a platform here, right? Let's use this as an example. This is the Owen Jones show. It's your show. You've put it together. You've organised it. You've done all the research and all the production work. Without you giving myself and Gavan a platform, we're not on YouTube right now. It's part of your freedom of expression that you get to decide how your platform is used. You get to decide who goes on it. If I wanted my own platform, I could set up my own YouTube channel, I suppose, but I haven't. So if you were to take me off your platform, that's nothing to do with my freedom of expression. You've just said, "Oh, well, fair enough, Sam, but I really fancy listening to Gavan for a bit. So just, pipe down for a while or go off." That's nothing to do with my freedom of expression. If, however, what happens is that the government comes in and says, "Owen, right, you have to have Sam Fowles on your platform because we, the government, think Sam Fowles is great." Never happened, but whatever. But we think the government is great. We think, and you have to have him on your platform. Then that will be the government dictating to you how you use your freedom of expression. And so what you have in sort of conflating speech with platform is the whole thing is reversed, and we're now talking about how we force people to give their platform to opinions they consider offensive or racist or just stupid and not worth talking about.
I mean, it's like, for example, if in the street someone had a megaphone and I asked to use the megaphone and I started bellowing all sorts of terrible nonsense or whatever, and then that person said, "Could I have my megaphone back, please?" That's not infringing my right to freedom of speech. It's just I borrowed someone's megaphone, which doesn't belong to me. I mean, the point of Matthew Goodwin, by the way, I'm going to say this. I'm sure I'm now attacking. Is this me cancelling him, or is that
probably
criticizing him is now attacking his freedom of speech?
Yeah.
Matthew Goodwin is famous. Well, he isn't famous, but he was known in the 2017 election because he said if Labour get to 40%. Oh no, 37%. He'd eat his book live on television. Then was forced to eat his book live on television. Literally did that on Sky News. But recently, he's got himself. He's claiming again his freedom of speech is being attacked because an email which he sent to an academic who criticised him in Open Democracy, in which he threatened to sue the academic for things he'd said about him, was released. And Matthew Goodwin cited that as an example of how he was being bullied for his own opinion.
Yeah.
I just can't even. I mean, Gavin, let's talk about that. I mean, because of it, that's what they're doing a lot of the time, aren't they? They're conflating intentionally essentially a brand of conservative thought in Britain and elsewhere. What they're doing is presenting the right to say things, not just to say things on a platform, but not to be challenged, is being equated with freedom of speech. Because when actually people exercise their right to say they disagree with them and to characterize their speech as they see fit, they then deem that as an attack on freedom of speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not very difficult to dig down into a lot of these, exactly what Sam did there, which I think is very important, to dig down into these sort of events that happen on campuses and suddenly take on this kind of mythic status. And when you actually look into what's happened, you inevitably, you can see this in the US as well, where there's always been a lot of lazy journalism in the US about US campuses, which has taken up an even lazier journalism in the UK and Ireland and elsewhere, which just recycles rumors that move further and further away from what were often very sort of complex and long and drawn out conflicts. So, there's always a sensational aspect to this, and that's part of the point. And the hypocrisy of these events is also part of the point, because it's a particular kind of power play. And I think that what's going on in campuses now in the UK involves a kind of a cross-section of groups that have overlapping interests. You have the government action, which we can talk about a bit more in relation to the recent report, but this is also the latest in a sequence of different things. So, for example, it's only a year, I think it was 2018, where Joe Johnson asked the Joint Committee on Human Rights to look into a freedom of speech crisis on UK campuses, and they found, again, that there was nothing. But of course, this is at the same time as the government was extending the prevent agenda and extending the reporting duty, which means that lecturers on campuses in England are expected to essentially spy on their students and report on their students who are Muslim or Muslim-looking if they show signs of radicalization, which inevitably means looking at them and trying to adjudicate whether their speech could become a security concern. So this is something which is absolutely detrimental to freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of assembly on campus. So what we're really looking at in this politics is a hypocrisy which is structured into it. And the question becomes, what kind of power play, what kind of issues can claim the status of a freedom of speech issue in public realm? And it's exactly the kind of thing that Matthew Godwin and others are up to at the moment, which is the sort of, the playbook for that. If you get to speak, if you get attention, well, then you benefit from it. If you get cancelled on a platform, whatever that means, because it's not dealt with in the recent report in any detail, there are many types of protests which don't constitute no platforming, but they get called no platforming all the time, and they're perfectly democratic forms of protest. But either way, you win into the spectacle.
Your sound's got a bit. Let's have a see. One second. There's something wrong. There's a bit of feedback there as well. We'll work it out. I'll just message you, but we'll work it out. Just while we sort that out, we will come back to him. Sam, let's talk us through what the government's proposals are. And what
Right. Well, it's sort of exploded this week, but actually this has been going on and building for quite a long time. And we're in this weird situation where what the government is proposing to do is protect free speech. And it's going to do that by expanding the power of the state to tell people what they can and can't say and who they can and can't give a platform to. And this kicked off back in September when the government issued guidelines to schools saying you're not permitted to use learning materials produced by any extreme organizations. And by extreme organizations, we mean a huge range of people, including anyone who criticizes capitalism, which, I mean, I'm not a particular critic of capitalism, but it seems to me there are, that's not a particularly extreme thing to say. And very slowly, the government has been building up its control over what can and can't be said. And this is just the next stage in that. And so you've got the free speech champion in the Office for Students, who is going to essentially look into universities and decide if they're giving a sufficient number of speaker slots to people of whom the government approves. This comes on the back of ministers saying to universities, we're not going to give you any COVID relief unless you're making sure you give a platform to people of whom we approve. And then on top of this, they're proposing a law that will allow people who have been no platformed or discriminated against by being criticized to sue the university that's responsible for that. And this is weird in two ways. Firstly, that law actually already exists. It's called the Human Rights Act. And if someone discriminates against you or denies you your right to freedom of speech in some way, then you have a right to bring a claim against them under the Human Rights Act, except the government want to abolish the Human Rights Act. And so they're going to get rid of that, but put this new law in place, which allows people to essentially do the same thing. But it seems very likely that it will be aimed at people who are perceived as racist or homophobic or transphobic, who are not being given enough attention, enough privilege, essentially. On top of this, the government have banned unconscious bias training in the civil service, and this also, I think, fits into a wider program of cuts to any sort of cultural or social sector that might create oppositional criticism of the wider state. And subjects you see in universities, subjects like humanities having their funding eliminated, arts, despite being a highly profitable sector, having its public funding eliminated. And I think all of this is part of the same thing, which is that sectors that create criticism are being slowly choked off. And believe it or not, that's not actually going for many people that are supporting this. And if you look at you mentioned the Adam Smith Institute report before, this is bearing in mind the Adam Smith Institute's stated objective is to encourage small government, so not government interference. What they're proposing is ministers have the power to go and break up student unions which do too much politicking in areas of which the government or the ASI, I suppose, disapprove. And so we're seeing this sort of pseudo crisis of freedom of speech being used for a massive expansion of state power and sort of state control of what you can and can't talk about.
So what I'm going to do now, that was extremely insightful. I'm going to try, there was something wrong with Gavan Sam, but we're going to try. Let's see what happens. Because when I unmuted him, I've silenced him. He's been cancelled on the show by his microphone. But I'm going to unmute and see what happens. I can hear myself. Why is that? So at the moment, when I unmute myself, I can just hear my own stupid voice. Which is not being...
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. You can.
I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to mute you while I ask the question, and then I'm going to let you speak, and hopefully it won't be muffled. I want to hear your take on the government's proposals and what it means for free speech. 1 second, take a breath.
Okay, am I uncancelled? Oh, and I think so.
Yeah, let's hear the sound.
Okay, well, I'll write my cancelled column straight after this. I promise you. I've had a look at the document today, and I had a look at the executive summary. And I think that Sam's sort of summary of the backstory to this document, and again the sort of structured hypocrisies and the particular political drive of it, I think is really spot on. I think if you read the document, what you'll see is that there is a real tendentiousness of evidence. And it goes back to what we've talked about already here, that there is a sort of a crisis discourse, free speech under siege. And yet when we try to actually dig into and look at specific empirical actual examples, very, very little evidence of this comes through. And when it does, things always look far more complex than the way that they're rendered in terms of this kind of discourse of crisis of freedom of speech. So in the document itself, you get right at the start an admission that most staff and most students, it says, respect freedom of speech. But there's evidence that a minority of students and academics, it says, having a disproportionate influence on censoring expression on campus. But again, there's very, very little evidence of this. It says platforming is a problem. Again, it doesn't really define what's involved in that, because there are many, many different kinds of practices which come to be called no platforming. But it gets around this by saying one no platforming incident is too many. It has generalities such as there's a rise of intolerance and cancel culture on our campuses, and it doesn't really tell us what constitutes intolerance or campus culture, or why intolerance in the context of the university is necessarily bad. And here I think it's worth making a number of points about the specificity of universities here, because one of the problems about free speech debates is that they treat speech as a kind of undifferentiated good, as just a thing, and don't reckon with the way that speech and communication is organized differently, editorialized in the media in particular ways, institutionalized in particular ways in universities and different kinds of bodies. So when it comes to thinking about freedom of speech and academic freedom, the report treats academic freedom as simply a kind of an extension of freedom of speech. And that's actually not really the case. Because even somebody as sort of mainstream as the Yale Law School Professor Robert Post makes very clear that one of the things that sets academic freedom apart from having the freedom to engage in your subject without fear of coercion or fear of restriction. And let's face it, one of the things that restricts academics in Britain now most grievously is the precarity that they're subject to. The fact that people constantly have to think about where their next short-term contract is going to come from, and what kind of research is going to help them to be able simply to have a job in 6 months or 12 months' time, or whatever it might be. So precariousness is the single greatest threat to academic freedom in the future right now, putting that into practice.
So, Gavin, 1 second. Sorry, you've vanished there in terms of audio. To be honest, I'm just looking up. Do you have any headphones? Because what you're saying is very, very important. But it kind of just fades out completely. So now we can't actually hear anything.
Okay, my microphone and just use the microphone of the computer.
Yeah, maybe yes. That was bad audio, yeah. You're fading out. It was so important what you were saying. That's why it was frustrating.
I do it now. It's kind of a Blue Peter moment. Let's see what happens. There we go. All right. The microphone has been cast aside. How's that?
That actually sounds a lot better, yeah. So carry on saying what you were saying just there.
When you buy these fancy microphones to, enhance.
Oh, actually, no. I don't think your microphone was plugged in. I think that might have been the issue. Because actually, it doesn't sound any different. It just sounded it sounds muffled and then muffles out completely.
Don't say that, because the last thing I want to appear is the kind of academic that can't actually plug in their own microphone. We're playing too many cliches. But where did I fade out there?
Quite a lot of it. I'm not going to lie. The second half.
This up there. All right, yeah. Let me try to retrace what I was trying to say there. I might start somewhere. else. I was talking about the fact, I think, that one of the things that the report conflates, and again, I just read the introduction and the executive summary, so maybe it does more work on this elsewhere. But one of the things that it conflates right from the start is freedom of speech and academic freedom, and they are not the same thing. And I think I was saying, and I just want to emphasize this, that, I'm not working in a UK university, but I have a lot of contact with them. I work a lot as an external examiner in the UK. And the single greatest threat to academic freedom in the UK university system is precariousness, is the fact that people are trying simply to do enormous amounts of work, to research things perhaps that they think will not alienate people, but help them perhaps be able to get the next contract and so forth. Precariousness is the enemy of academic freedom, because academic freedom is meant to be predicated on having the status and the security to investigate your subject area without fear or favor. Now, that said, the conflation of academic freedom and freedom of speech is very important as well, because they're not the same thing. And when you think about what a university is, in the same way as a radio show or a podcast will editorialize, it will decide who to have on, it will decide what the topics are, it will decide, Sorry,
yeah, Gavin. Sorry, 1 second. It just gradually fades out. It gradually fades out. Someone says it sounds like you're in the bath, which you're not in the bath. We can see you here. I'm just frustrated because it's so important what you're saying, but it is very hard to hear increasingly.
Okay. Should I try through the medium of dance, or I'm not sure.
If you write down, okay. It's very hard. I'll just bring in. Let me just bring in Sam. Sorry, it's really frustrating because it's very important what you're saying, but it is maybe there's echo cancellation on. I don't know. It could take us a while. It seemed fine before you came on air.
Yeah.
While we just have a look at that, Sam, to bring you in again, there is a broader context, isn't there? Which is the Thatcher government, as you wrote about, it stripped universities of power to determine their funding, handed it to ministers and to officials, and the Cameron government, you wrote, eliminated funding for humanities. Since 2015, universities have been forced to crack down on political dissent. You gave examples. So actually, there is an onslaught against free speech on campus that isn't being discussed, and that actually comes from the right.
Yeah, very much so. And I think this is actually part of that. I think it's so ironic that the pseudo free speech advocates tend to quote George Orwell all the time without actually, I think, ever having read George Orwell. But this is classic doublespeak. It's saying, we're going to save free speech while actually doing the total opposite. And this has been I think a very long trend, and it plugs into just a broader trend, I think, and certainly, my involvement as a barrister in this trend, I was against the Prime Minister in the prorogation case. I was against the Prime Minister in the Brexit debates, the Brexit extension case, and it ultimately comes down to the same thing, which is lots and lots of attempts to expand the unaccountable power of the executive branch at the expense of everyone else. And whereas with the prorogation, we were talking about expanding that power at the expense of the elected parliament and the courts. In this, we're talking about expanding sort of soft power, because universities, and particularly students' unions, and this goes all the way back to the 1980s and indeed beyond, tend to be melting pots where people come up with ideas that challenge the status quo and often challenge the sitting government, and challenge things like racial stereotypes, transphobic stereotypes, etc. And these, as Keynes said, probably better than I'm about to say it, every politician is just saying something that some dusty academic said already. That was Keynes's words, was dusty academic. But what I think is happening, and what I think this is part of, is a broader attempt to control the generation of new ideas and the generation of new discourses, and to ensure that those who are in a position to do so are friendly to the existing government, and by contrast ensure that those who are not friendly to the existing government are not in a position to do so. So the government is cutting down space in academia by cutting funding to the humanities, by stopping universities deciding how funding is distributed and allowing civil servants to do it instead, by telling recently telling museums what they can and can't put on display, and if they put up displays that are not sufficiently celebratory of the British Empire, then they'll have funding cuts, and attacking the National Trust for doing research into the links between their houses and slavery. And this is not, as it's portrayed, sort of ideological research, attacking something. This is literally what the National Trust was doing, for example, was literally finding out something about the history of their houses. And all of this is being eliminated. So you're cutting down space for debate that the government, or discourse the government doesn't really like. And at the same time, they're saying, right, we've got our free speech czar, we've got our new non-human rights ability to sue universities, and this will make sure that the universities give lots and lots of space to people that we like, and so this way you sort of, I suppose, tilt the balance and change the discourse and change the creation of new ideas so that they're favourable to the government, and they help a certain view of the way the state should be over the long term.
So I think that was an extremely clear explanation. I think Gavan has been silenced by very bad technology, which is, I know, because what he was saying was so important. So we will have him on another time. I don't think he can even hear us now. It's got even worse. We've been silenced. So now it must be extremely baffling for him. But thank you both for coming on. And I'm sorry to Gavan about the silencing technique that has been used. I've
lost sound completely.
I know you have. I know. We've been WhatsApping. While Sam was speaking, me and Gavan were, whilst I was listening, I was also trying to sort that out. But thank you so much to Sam for that very clear explanation. And thanks, Gavan, for the bits we heard. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
Cheers. Thanks for having us both on. I say this on behalf of us both, including Gavan, who can't talk.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it. So now next we have, we're very honoured to have on the next guest, because I think a super fan. Yeah, I'm a super fan. That's embarrassing for her. Let's bring in Nesrine Malik, who is my colleague at the Guardian newspaper and also an incredible author. Immediately buy her book, We Need News Stories. She's an incredible writer and one of the best writers working in the British press. I mean, some would say it's a low bar, but she exceeds the low bar very well. Nesrine, hello.
Hi, I bet you say that to all your guests.
I genuinely don't. And anyway, even if I hype up the compliments for some, in this case, I mean it. So we'll just leave it at that.
It's fine. I'll take it. Compliments are thin on the ground these days, being on the left and writing for the Guardian. You don't get compliments very often.
That's true, especially in our social media feeds. So, Nesrine, there is a crisis of free speech in which right-wing opinions, you can't even say right-wing things anymore without being silenced. What do you think about that?
You can't even be a conservative, according to the Telegraph today. You can't be a conservative these days without that being a toxic thing. I mean, look, this is something that's been actually happening in the US for a very, very long time. And one thing that's quite helpful is to see it as a repetition or a mimicking of the US playbook that began in like the 1980s, really, in the academy, in universities, which were the only spaces that had, as your previous guest said, that had a community of different identities, younger people who tend to kind of challenge the status quo. And so they are the first targets. Whenever there's a kind of mobilization against progressive causes, social justice, racial justice, gender, LGBTQ issues, universities are the first target for conservative government. So they're not really having a brainwave. They're just copying something that worked very well in the US about 40 years ago.
So in the current context, in the UK context, how ominous do you think the government's new plans are? And politically speaking, what do you think the aim is? What are they trying to mobilize?
So I think there's two things going on. So you've got kind of two levels of culture war happening in the UK at the moment. You've got kind of the propaganda end, which is silly culture war skirmishes about the flag, about British fish, the kind of Brexit-related propaganda culture war, which I think is just indulgence and frippery and distraction. But there's a far more serious part of it. It's kind of the front line of the culture war, which is very impactful and which has an agenda which is to forestall the progress of sort of social justice movements. And the second thing is to kind of slowly make the environment more hostile towards them as well. So it's a popular opinion changing exercise, and it's very dangerous because the right has so many resources in its hands. It's in government, it's overwhelmingly amplified in the media, and with a kind of sustained assault against Black Lives Matter, against students, against trans or kind of gender related issues, all the issues that are or belong or have a home on the left and that are designed or intend to promote equality are targeted at this kind of popular culture stigmatization by the government. I think that's very, very dangerous because it does two things. It sets up right-wing parties, Conservative Party, for re-election in the next election cycle. And the second thing is it casts suspicion and doubt on all these movements before they've even started. So before people even listen to what Black Lives Matter has to say, for example, they have heard and seen and read so many things about the movement being Marxist and being violent that there is a kind of a ready-made suspicion there. So not even in the long term, in the short term, it's very empowering of the right and very disempowering of the left.
In terms of this whole discussion on who's being silenced, I mean, that point you made about the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph editor, so the editor of a national newspaper, complaining about Conservatives being silenced in a country in which there was an 80-seat Conservative majority and most of the British press quite aggressively support the government and have a very strong right-wing editorial line. The two biggest circulation papers in the country are The Sun and the Daily Mail. The biggest circulation broadsheet paper is the Telegraph. In terms of, if we look at the British media overall, the national media, the government's own statistics show it's the second most socially exclusive in the country. It's dominated by white men from very privileged backgrounds. That's what all the objective evidence shows. And people of colour are marginalised. Working class voices are marginalised. We have a big constant moral panic about Muslims. There are very few Muslim commentators with a platform. I mean, what does that tell us? The fact that we constantly and those who do speak out themselves are often on the receiving ends of threats, which somehow never seem to make it into the entire discussion on silencing. What does it? I mean, what does all this tell us?
So it's very important for dominant forces to project themselves as weak. This is like one of the main things that happen when a certain political ideology becomes really powerful. The only way to sustain its power is to pretend that there is a kind of incipient assault or threat to it all the time. So whether, for example, with Brexit, when there was a vote where Brexiteers won, they had to frame their victory as fragile and prone to being overturned all the time, because that's the only way they could maintain momentum behind it. So it's called I call it victim claiming. So in order to maintain your dominance, you have to steal victimhood from people who have legitimate grievances and claim it as your own. So that's the only way really to maintain this sense of threat, to maintain this sense of precarity, is if you convince yourself. I think these people really believe it. I think these people who are, sitting at the helm of extremely popular, widely circulating newspapers really do believe that they are in a minority, because if they stop believing that, then they get complacent. So the only way to kind of keep creating a sense of moral panic, keep creating a sense of threat, keep people voting for you and buying your newspapers and kind of rushing towards what you have to sell, is to tell them that their position is consistently under threat by people that are very weak, that have no political capital, that have no actual capital. And so it's a trick that's not just meant to undermine certain groups, it's meant to maintain momentum and maintain support for right-wing causes, because once you acknowledge that you have won, then you create the space for people to start challenging you.
It's a really fascinating phenomenon of the sore winner, the winner who acts like a sore loser. It's very like Trumpism as well, I suppose.
Exactly.
I mean, I remember back in 2019, I remember demonstrations going on. I think it was against proroguing or something, and the far right had mobilized these demonstrations at the same time, and they were alternating chants of Boris, we love you, and shouting at left-wing protesters about hanging them on lampposts. And I just found that interesting, because the left is often presented as a terrible threat, and random posts, which are often obnoxious and rude sometimes, but are extrapolated to say this is what the left's like. And yet you get far-right thugs, Tommy Robinson, coming out and saying he supported Boris Johnson. Far-right thugs, in those cases, are en masse yelling, alternating chants of how much they love Boris Johnson, how they wish to hang their political opponents. During the general election, there was a big story about a Tory advisor being punched by a Labour activist, and then the video came out and showed no such thing happened, but there was 2 Labour canvassers, both in their 70s, were beaten up. One of them a woman, cracked ribs. That wasn't part of this whole debate. I mean, it's interesting that, isn't it? You get often, rude, obnoxious posts by people on social media, and they're portrayed as these are a violent mob. And yet when you get far-right types pledging their allegiance to Boris Johnson and saying explicitly, as Britain First did when they encouraged people to join the Conservative Party, that they were going to go after the traitors who opposed Boris Johnson, who they called a nationalist, not part of the discussion.
You see, it's kind of a tedious point, but it all comes back to the media. It all comes back to the space people have to make these arguments. And if you have a media ecosystem that is overwhelmingly normalizing and minimizing the violence and the kind of racism and Islamophobia of the right and the far right, and I think the distinction between them is beginning really to become difficult to discern, then these tropes and these ideas become very established in the mainstream psyche, and they become very difficult to dislodge. And so you can state these facts, these sort of evidence and facts and details and figures and numbers of hate crime, rising hate crime against minorities, and compare it to what happens on the left. And it doesn't make any difference, because you need enough people and enough outlets and a media ecosystem that marshals those facts into a narrative and projects them to voters and consumers on a day-to-day basis. And that doesn't happen. What you have instead, I did a quick search today for my column this week on how many articles the Telegraph publishes about Black Lives Matter, even though Black Lives Matter protests ended 8 months ago. And it's an average of 4 or 5 times a week, as if it's like the most current threat ever. When you have that level of like a fire hose, basically, of information that is that brands left-wing causes as violent and does not do the same with right-wing figures or right-wing causes, and you have maybe 99% of the media landscape doing that, then it's very, very hard to dislodge these narratives. And people, even when you give them the evidence, that's just one little part of an entire diet they're consuming day in, day out. So it always comes back to the media, the volume of misinformation that goes out there, and also the political support and heft that is thrown behind the media by a government that's been in power for a decade now.
Finally, what the right are doing what they've done very successfully amongst certainly a large swathe of the population is to portray the left as intolerant, opposed to free speech. How do we make a clear, coherent? I mean, often because free speech is intentionally distorted and twisted as to what it actually is. So, you know, there is nothing in the UN Declaration of Human Rights that gives people the right to a Twitter account, for example. I've scanned through that one. But, you know, the right to a platform and so on, or the right to say things without being challenged seems to be the definition of free speech that a lot of people on the right have decided on. So how does the left make an argument which is, you know, to counteract this idea, which, even though a lot of this is to do, as you say, with basically the balance of forces, if you have a media ecosystem which is dominated by the right, it doesn't matter how persuasive or factually based your arguments are, you're at a colossal disadvantage. And it's not about objective truths; it's about power relations, and you're going to lose against you know, a much stronger force. But how do we make the arguments that when, you know, that this isn't actually about onslaughts of free speech, and actually it's the right, with, for example, the government's new legislation on a free speech czar, which is a very Orwellian concept, forcing people to platform individuals against their will, which is an attack on free association and independent organizations. How do we make the arguments?
So this is an unpopular answer, but we basically don't make the argument, because most of the time when these arguments are deployed, they're done so cynically. I really doubt that people who talk about free speech in these absolutist terms really believe that that's what free speech is. It's kind of a cynical manipulation of the notion of free speech to guilt people into accepting objectionable views. And I think we waste too much time raking over the technicalities, invoking Enlightenment philosophers, trying to spell out like what's free speech, what's not free speech. And I think people know these technicalities, and they're choosing to elide them, to basically weaponize them for their own causes. So the first thing is, I don't think we should waste much time making the argument, because I think people know what the argument is. And the second thing is, we shouldn't let them guilt us via the kind of moral shaming of free speech into chilling us into ceding our right to object. And I think that a very big danger in these kind of civility discourse and the free speech discourse is that we end up ceding space because we don't want to look unreasonable. We don't want to look like we're impolite, like we're uncivil, like we're anti-free speech. But we are in a basically huge conflict, you know, a defining conflict between right and left-wing values at the moment, and the right is dominant. And what we need to do is basically enact and practice what we believe is free speech. And that includes, you know, being quite strident about no platforming, being quite confident about speech that we just don't want to entertain, and not then be distracted by all these kind of red herring conversations about what free speech is and what free speech isn't. I think most people know what free speech is. And I think the purpose of the free speech argument is that we get bogged down in who's a good free speech person, who is a bad free speech person, while we do that, all the objectionable speech that we should be spending time, you know, objecting to, boycotting, no platforming, objecting to, basically goes unchallenged. So I think the whole free speech argument, we've done it. We've been doing this for 2-3 years now. I think the arguments are clear. I think we should move on to doing the things that the right accuses us of doing all the time, which is shutting down free speech. If we think it deserves to be shut down and we're not throwing anybody in jail or saying their rights, then go for it. I think less argument, more practice is the way forward.
More practice. Love this. That's fantastic. Seriously, there's been a very powerful counterweight and an unashamed counter. I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? We're always in this defensive posture, which is the entire point of this entire discussion and debate. And what you're suggesting is to be a bit more proactive and not allow ourselves to be forced into a defensive posture where we're forced to trip over our own words to prove that we're not this menace that the right portrays us. That was fantastic. Nesrine, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, as I've said, do buy her book, We Need New Stories, and read her column in The Guardian, which is always a little treat for me. When I see a new Nesrine Malik piece appear, I'm like,
maybe.
I'm like, yeah, I'll read it. It's going to be great. Always is. Thank you so much. I'll speak to you soon, but I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Owen. It's really nice to speak to you.
Lots of love. She's great. Next, now this is really interesting because and horrifying, actually. It's really disturbing because when we talk about the actual threat which exists to freedom of speech on university campuses, this is the sort of discussion we don't hear. I'm going to bring in now Keir Milburn. Keir Milburn is a brilliant academic and also an author, by the way, of Generation Left. Everyone buy the book and read it. This show half the time just becomes a forced book list, but it's a great, very important book about how material circumstances married to progressive social values has made millennials and Generation Z has pushed them to the left in a way that is without historical precedent, but also is an academic at the University of Leicester. Hello, how are you doing, Keir?
I'm doing okay, actually. Yeah, I've been enjoying the show. Set it up nicely.
We had a few technical hitches, but we got there. We clawed our way through to you and to hear what's happened. And this is really important. When you hear, because we hear about this threat to freedom of speech on campus, do you just want to tell us what's currently going on at the University of Leicester?
Yeah. Let me set the scene a little bit, right? So on Monday, the 18th of January, which is also Blue Monday, which is the most depressing day of the year. So the senior management at the University of Leicester chose that day to send an email informing 145 staff at the University of Leicester were at risk of redundancy, right? Which is pretty callous in a pandemic, especially when everybody who works at universities were student facing, have been working absolutely ridiculous hours over the last year to try to cope with the pandemic. I work at the business school at the University of Leicester, so I'm going to focus in a little bit on myself. Very selfish of me, but it's an interesting story, right? So there's 16 academics at the business school at University of Leicester who've been told we're being targeted for redundancy. But the interesting thing is we're specifically being told we're being targeted for redundancy because we do critical scholarship and or political economy, right? So one of my colleagues has been told by senior management that they were being targeted for redundancy because they detected a tone in their work which was critical of mainstream management practices. Right? How can you be a scholar in the field of management and not take a critical look at the field you're studying? Right? Especially at the moment. I mean, do you think that management in the pandemic, or the management of the pandemic, should be beyond criticism? You know, it's ridiculous. I've also had a colleague who's been told by senior management that it's not the research they've done in the past that's put them in the frame for redundancy. It's suspicions about the research they may do in the future. Sort of future crime, sort of. It's it's preposterous, but it's really not funny, right? But I'm one of the 16. My livelihood is at threat. And, you know, it's an outrageous attack on academic freedom, right? Because academic freedom should be that scholars have the autonomy to do the research, follow where the search of knowledge takes them, basically. That's the point. That's how you create new knowledge, right? And it really is at the stage where if these redundancies go ahead at Leicester, you know, the precedent is set. You can just rip up academic freedom as far as UK universities, UK higher education is concerned. So, look, that's bad, right? But that's the overt reason, because we do critical scholarship. We have a critical tone towards mainstream management practices. That's the official story about why these 16 of us are getting targeted. There are theories going round that, in fact, this is a bit of union busting, right? Because out of those 16 academics at the threat of redundancy, 8 of us are either elected union officials or departmental union reps, right? I'm not going to draw any conclusion from that, Owen. You and the viewers can draw their own conclusion about what might be going on there. So that's my department. I think it's pretty outrageous. But like the redundancies around the rest of the university are just as bad. So there's been a bit of a tension around the redundancies in the English department at Leicester because the redundancies were linked to this idea that they needed to make redundancies because they wanted to decolonize the curriculum. You know, as far as I'm aware, that makes no sense because the colleagues of mine who are being targeted for redundancy are very active in trying to widen the curriculum and decolonize the curriculum, right? But like, it's going to be no surprise that sort of framing, right, has just drawn a huge amount of attention from the right-wing press. It's just placed these academics slap bang in the middle of the culture war. And the level of abuse that has been directed at the people who've been threatened with redundancy, the amount of abuse on social media, it's been absolutely horrendous. It's just an absolute abdication of care of those colleagues. It's really outrageous, I think. And just to return back actually to what Gavin was saying earlier about precarity, and that's the frightening effect that has on academic freedom and free speech at universities. 150 casualised staff at the university were made redundant last year at the beginning of the pandemic. I've even had staff who are not threatened with redundancy at the School of Business have been warned about what they like or retweet on social media in relation to these redundancies. Now, this is, you can imagine the atmosphere at the University of Leicester is one of fear, suspicion, paranoia. That is not the atmosphere in which you have academic freedom and knowledge production, right? That's just it's just ridiculous. I'd move on actually as well. Just to say give a little bit of context to that, because what's going on at Leicester is just one of a wave of redundancies going around the country, and they're happening at the moment. That leads us to say why are these all happening at the moment? Of course, the pandemic sets the sort of background to that, but beyond that, you'd have to sort of say this is not an accident. This is sort of the outcome of government policy, and government policy going back quite a long way, actually, right? And I think the story goes a little bit like this. Higher education is turned into a market. You have to sell yourself. So what happens as soon as that happens, that's brought in, is there's been a huge wave of building across universities, because you want nice shiny buildings that look nice in a university prospectus, or you want to build a university accommodation because the rents from students are a valuable source of income. How do you pay for those buildings? You take out loans. You securitize those loans. You offer the future income streams from rents to securitize those loans. And the more loans you take out, the more vulnerable universities are to a decline in student numbers, right? And I think that's part of this. The reason why what we're seeing is this sort of universities leading towards offering a very conservative, standardized sort of curriculum. Then, and as Sam was saying earlier, Sam and Gavin actually, you have the elimination of funding for the humanities, right? And the space for critical thinking within university gets shut down, partly by government policy, but also this background of the fact that the universities are being financialized and put really at risk about the student numbers declining, etc., etc., etc. Actually, that's an important point, right? Because I think students are also getting a raw dealing in this, and that's the other side of this. So this idea that universities really need to pay off their loans. They need to make sure that they don't break their covenants around these loans. So earlier in the year, with the pandemic, you'd look around and you notice that universities were very, very keen on offering face-to-face teaching, despite the risks involved, basically. And we can see the logic of that. We need to get students to come to campus so that they take up their accommodation, and then we get the money. Apparently £1 billion worth of rent has been spent by students who haven't been able to take up their accommodation through the pandemic. That's the other side of it. And in fact, look, there's a big wave of rent strikes going around universities.
So, Gavin, what you're talking about is, it just illustrates the hypocrisy of this whole debate and actually the genuine threat to academic inquiry and free speech that's actually taking place at universities. And what's happening to you is horrendous, and you require support and solidarity. So what actively do you think, how does this feed into, what firstly can people do to support you and your colleagues, but also in the wider political sense, how does this feed into the sort of demands that the left need to be making?
Yeah, well, that's the reason I raised the student rent strikes. Basically, the student rent strikes and these wave of the wave of redundancies, they're both sides of the fact that there's this totally broken model of higher education in the UK. It's totally broken, and it is partly the government's fault, because the government has just offered no none of the support that's offered to other sectors of the economy, basically. And you have to think that that really does fit into like the whole culture war hostility that you've been talking about. It sort of fits into my work you were talking about earlier around Generation Left, really, about, in the conservative mind, the reason that young people are going to university, the reason the young people are tending to turn to the left is because they're getting brainwashed at universities. That's just not the case. Young people are moving to the left because their material prospects and their material living standards are taking an absolute nosedive. So these things are all linked up. So what the things that the left and basically just people who care about academic freedom and about universities and about education, the thing they should do is support the student rent strike. The thing they should do is support the lecturers who are facing redundancy. And so we're at Leicester, we're just sending out consultative ballots around about going on strike on this issue. Any of my colleagues at Leicester, I'd urge you to vote in favour of those strikes, because that's the only thing that senior management will listen to. So we have to struggle within universities and try to alter the balance of power, because what goes along with this sort of financialization is this sort of dictatorial top-down form of management. Universities used to be a college of academics, which would be self-managing. You can see it at the University of Leicester, that the academic representation in the sort of governing councils have been sort of edged out a little bit. So we need to struggle about within universities, I think, but we also have to struggle on the level of the government and general policy. The government could have solved this straight away by giving some of the support that they gave to other sectors, of course. But we also need to, it's a little bit of a big ask of your viewers, but basically we need a completely different model of higher education in this country. A different model of how it's governed, a different model of how it's financed, and different model of what education is all about and the role it can play in society.
I mean, I think summed that up very, very eloquently. And these are the sorts of struggles and battles which are not, unsurprisingly, being platformed by mainstream media outlets, as we hear a growing moral panic about essentially the fact, let's be honest with you, that for the reasons your book, Generation Left, goes into, for material reasons, people under the age of 40, their lived experiences and right-wing ideology are on a collision course. That's not because they're being brainwashed. It's not because of peer pressure. It's not because they're not being exposed to a wide variety of opinions in a country run by the Conservatives with a largely conservative media. It's simply because of their material circumstances. And this assault we see at the universities is partly, obviously, ideological, but it comes from a form of right-wing insecurity as well, which is, although they have a huge majority of support, there are exceptions, obviously. There are older people who are very much on the left, but they do objectively have a large majority amongst the older Britons. That the evidence shows that, in 1983, when Thatcher won a landslide, young people voted for her. She had a lead amongst younger people. So and the evidence suggests that actually as people get older, it's not that they become more right-wing. I mean, in 1968, the most pro-Vietnam War generation in America were the under 25s. The most anti-Vietnam War generation were older Americans. In the mid-80s, the most pro-Reagan for a period were the young. And obviously now that's not the case with American young people. A lot of them are powered Bernie Sanders. But that's what we're seeing, isn't it? It's partly a culture war thing, but it is actually partly a sense of, oh my word, these people are going to get older, and actually the evidence doesn't suggest they necessarily become more right-wing at all, and the material reasons suggest they're not. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and cleanse the universities of the causes of why they're being brainwashed, when actually that isn't the case at all. It's the conditions in which they live. And in the midst of all that, the actual threats to academic freedom, like what you're going through, are ignored. And that's why this is so important, and that's why people need to support you, to support the student strikes. And to also read your book, Generation Left, which is a fantastic exposition of this. But seriously, Keir, I really appreciate it. And certainly I'll be doing everything I can to support you. And I hope people watching or listening to this will stand alongside you as well, because it's a critical battle.
Thanks very much, John. I really appreciate it.
Cheers, Keir. I'll speak to you soon. thank you so much, everyone, for watching it, wherever you watched it, even though I can't force you to watch it on YouTube because you keep watching it on Facebook. But that's my own fault. I put it on Facebook. I just try and bully people to click on the link with mixed success. But nonetheless, wherever you watch this, thank you. For those listening to it on the podcast, thank you as well. And to support us as we expand in terms of the videos and also the podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, press the notifications bell, like the video. Quite a bit of homework. No, I mean, this takes seconds, but it helps a lot. Please go to the podcast and subscribe. Give us cheeky 5-star if you're up for that. On Patreon, thank you so much as ever, everyone supporting us there and helping decide the videos, polemics, interviews that we do on the channel, on the podcast, on patreon.com/OwenJones84. Really appreciate it. Sorry about the tech issues before. These things happen because, partly because we have a catastrophic broadband situation in this country, and the Labour Party did have a suggestion for how to fix that. It didn't happen though, did it? So now we have to pick up the pieces. And that happens to be occasionally disrupted videos and podcasts by technical hitches. But we worked through it and everyone was fantastic. And I learned a lot. And I hope you all did as well. I know someone will go, well, where was the right-wing voices? I do actually interview right-wing voices occasionally on this channel. But I would say this conversation and debate has been monopolized by the right in the media, in politics. And I think it's about time to balance it out. And that's what we tried to do here, to show the so-called assault on free speech by the left isn't based in the evidence, but there is a threat to free speech coming from the actual government, the people with power. Those are the people in charge. And the fact they pretend to be besieged and under threat, and somehow it's the left who are in charge, that they use that as a justification to try and even further marginalize progressive and left voices. And that has to be fought back. So thank you, everyone, for listening to the huge wisdom that we had today. We will be back on Sunday, and I will announce shortly who the guests will be. But I think we're going to have a really important discussion on Sunday at 5 o'clock. So please do join us then. Thank you, everybody, as ever. We got through this. It was a really interesting discussion, and I will see you soon.